The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, are the nations making up the geopolitical group of countries known as the BRICS powerful enough to compete with the West for global dominance? Then, author and journalist Ece Temelkuran on the rising wave of populism around the world. That's next on The Agenda. The BRICS, named after the 5 founding nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, started as a forum for the world's 5 largest emerging economies. Now it's expanding into other parts of the globe and courting countries traditionally allied with the U.S. What is behind this impetus for expansion, and can it disrupt the current Western-dominated global order? Let's ask. In Quebec City, Quebec, Carrie Buck. She's former Canadian ambassador to NATO and a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. And with us here in studio, Rohinton Medora, professor of practice at McGill University and a distinguished fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Seva Gunitsky, associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Delighted to have you two back here in our studio. And former Ambassador Buck, great to see you on the line from Quebec City. We're going to do a little background here just to get everybody up to scratch on what the BRICS are. So I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring this up. The acronym was originally coined a long time ago, actually. Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill did this in 2001 in a research paper. He argued the growth of what was then called the BRIC countries, that was just Brazil, Russia, India, China, was poised to challenge the wealthy G7 economies. Fast forward to 2006, Brazil, Russia, India, China create the BRIC group, and then South Africa joins in 2010, making it the BRICS. Now, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates are invited to become members effective January 1st of this year. The expanded group now has a combined population of about 3.5 billion people. That's almost half the world's inhabitants. And combined, their members' economies are worth more than $28.5 trillion. That's about 28% of the global economy. Okay, Seva, to you first. This year's BRICS summit was hosted in Russia. About 36 countries attended, more than 20 represented by heads of state, so this is clearly a big deal now. We know the West has been trying to isolate Russia. Can we infer from this showing Russia doesn't feel very isolated right now?
Well, that's certainly the message it wants to send. Putin loves the concept of BRICS. Russia loves BRICS because it can say, look, we're not isolated, as you say. We have friends. And not only do we have friends who are willing to stand up to the West together with us. So I think Putin would like a return to that kind of Cold War rhetoric of the West versus the rest. But a lot of it is just that, rhetoric, optics. In terms of substance, Russia is not leading anything. It's not the Cold War. It's not even the most important member of BRICS. China is arguably India. And it's become more reliant on those countries as a result of the 22 invasion. So it's important to highlight that Russia's power has not grown as a result of this. It's shrunk. But the one takeaway, I would say, from this meeting is that BRICS has really reached kind of a crossroads. Is it going to continue to be this kind of strategic hedging mechanism for countries that want to show that they're independent and powerful? Or is it going to turn into this real anti-American vehicle, which is what Russia and China seem to want? I think a lot of the members are still hedging their bets, playing China and Russia on one hand versus the West on the other hand. And it's a balancing act, and I think it's a balancing act that's becoming increasingly hard, and they may have to make a choice in the near future.
Carrie Buck, as you were watching what was emerging from Russia after the BRICS summit, what's on your list of accomplishments from that event?
Well, I agree that Russia sought to send a message to the world that they're not isolated, and I also agree that they failed in that. It's a small point, but it's a symbol. If you look at the declaration that came out of Kazan, it actually was very, very tepid on Ukraine. In a way, it was weaker than the previous summit because now the summit declaration from Kazan talks about the purposes of the Charter of the UN, which is code for territorial integrity.
I should just mention parenthetically here, Kazan is the name of the city where this summit took place inside Russia. Okay, Rohinton, your sort of prime takeaway from the BRICS get-together.
So I saw 3 things, Steve. First, There's more to BRICS than Russia. So I think the analysis and focus on Russia was in some ways wishful thinking. There was a lot more done. And so my second point, BRICS continues to widen and deepen. There are more members in BRICS. It is covering more and more topics. This year, for example, there was a grain exchange announced, and so it's fleshing out its institutional underpinnings. And third, summits are also important for what happens on the sidelines. And there was the first time in 5 years meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Premier Xi. And I'd say where BRICS goes and where global affairs go depend a lot on the China-India relationship. And if it gets warm, which it isn't right now, then that is something to look out for as well.
I'm going to come back to that because that clearly was an important thing. I actually want to ask you about who wasn't there, because Saudi Arabia was invited to join BRICS. MBS, right, Mohammed bin Salman, was noticeably absent from there. What do you read into that?
Saudi Arabia is in a tough position on this one. On the one hand, it has very ambitious plans to diversify away from oil and has huge investment requirements that even its own massive reserves cannot fund. And so in the BRICS, it has countries that are massive investors, they bring technology, and they don't ask a lot of questions about human rights and politics and so on. Saudi Arabia has an asset that's declining, and the thirsty countries are in the BRICS. And so there's a market assurance for its current product. That's the pro. On the con side, Saudi Arabia is very much reliant on the U.S. for a range of relationships. 75% of its arms come from the U.S. And so it is worried that it would be seen as having crossed a line. And so a traditionally cautious bureaucracy and decision-making structure is going to hedge, at least until the U.S. elections, because if Trump wins, and we might get into that, then Saudi Arabia might not want to be that brazen about joining BRICS.
Gotcha. Kerry Buck, I want to ask you about Turkey. Turkey is a NATO country. Turkey is the first NATO country seeking BRICS membership. What do we read into that?
Well, there are a number of factors pulling Turkey towards the BRICS. President Erdogan of Turkey has had a relatively good relationship with Vladimir Putin for years, certainly better than all other NATO leaders except for Hungary's Orban. Turkey refused to impose sanctions on Russia. Energy trade has spiked. They rely on energy supply from Russia. But it wasn't just about Russia. Turkey, China has also been seeing a rapprochement over the last while. Their foreign minister visited China in June. So this is all part of a gradual push by President Erdogan to diversify Turkey's foreign policy portfolio and reduce their dependence on the West, particularly but not only in the defense sector. So they're trying to play both sides, but there are also a number of push factors. I think that there's no world in which Turkey will, in the foreseeable future, seek to leave the West. They're still talking about their accession to the EU, and in one way, maybe their invitation and attendance at the BRICS summit was, a means of pressuring the EU into accelerating accession talks. Maybe it was to increase leverage with the U.S. But NATO, the EU are both very important Western groupings, very important to Turkey. And so they'll be walking that very difficult balancing act between the West and the BRICS, as will most other members of the BRICS.
Okay, Seva, it does sound like Turkey's trying to have a foot in both camps, though. Is that okay?
Well, it's kind of an extension of Turkey's foreign policy over the past decade or more, where it's trying to diversify its foreign policy, make connections outside the West, but it still wants to maintain connections with the West. And Erdogan is also chafing against what he sees as Western hegemony. He shares that in common with other BRICS members. But I think this is a good way for Turkey to get a measure of global clout and to remind the West, hey, I'm important, pay attention to me. This is something that you need to keep your eye on.
Can you imagine any other NATO countries being interested in joining the BRICS?
It would be very difficult to imagine at this point. I mean, do you know the Frederick Jameson quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism? I think it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine something like Canada in BRICS or something like that.
Not necessarily Canada, but I mean, there's a lot of countries in NATO, and is it on anybody's agenda?
It's hard to see that at this point. I think partly depends on the outcome of the election as well, how brazen countries want to be in terms of joining BRICS.
Well, since we're not going to know the outcome of the American election, not next Tuesday night for sure, might take a little longer than that, we shall see. Okay, Rohinton, how about this? When the BRICS was founded, or were founded, I guess it was intended to pose an economic challenge to the West, but it now looks like it's trying to pose a political challenge as well. Talk to us about the implications of that agenda.
So the two go hand in hand, everywhere and all the time. As an economist, I can say that. When the BRICS were formed and had their first summit in 2009, it was in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. There was a sense that that sort of Western view of how globalization works had failed massively. And so the BRICS, to be sure, were an intellectual and political statement. I would say that the economic weaponization of sanctions has led to that sort of connection between politics and economics. Therefore, the BRICS has been paying a lot of attention to things like having its own infrastructure bank to rival the World Bank, a payment system to rival the IMF, a payment system also to substitute for SWIFT, from which Russia was frozen out. And so there's the grain exchange to safeguard food supplies if there's further sanctions. So there's a sense that not only do we disagree with the West, but we have to build the plumbing to make sure that that means something. And that's what we're seeing is a slow and quite boring process of institution building, which might take years.
Seva, should the West feel threatened by this economic push by the BRICS?
Well, it started basically as an ideological alliance, but you're right that it's taking on economic elements. Right now, it's not a coherent body. Being a member of BRICS doesn't preclude you from joining any other security or economic organization. So it's not a coherent bloc in that Cold War sense. But at the same time, it can still lead to chipping away at the U.S.-led order, just as serving as a focal point for ideologies that don't follow the West. But still, I think we have to stress that there's a gap between how Russia presents BRICS, which is this unified, powerful force, and the reality, which is that these are countries that are trying to get the best deals with each other, that have tensions with each other, and that really have very little in common with each other other than a shared dislike of the West.
Well, Carrie Buck, I guess this may be a silly question, but it wouldn't be the first time I asked one on this program, and that is, if you want to go to the European Union headquarters, you know where to go. If you want to go to the International Criminal Court headquarters, you know where to go. There's a building. NATO headquarters, there's a building, there's a place. Does BRICS have a capital? Do they have a building? Do they have a headquarters?
Well, they don't, but neither does the G7. So I don't think that's the kiss of death for the BRICS, to be honest. What it is it's an ideological grouping that is starting to get a little more mature on the economic cooperation front, much, much slower in maturing on the front of political cooperation. And I don't think the BRICS will turn into a bloc. I think that it'll be one of many fora that most of the middle powers, aside from China and Russia, that belong to the BRICS, will choose to align itself with, but not completely. It'll still play in the G20. It'll still focus on the UN, ASEAN, et cetera, et cetera. So why not? I think three reasons. Apart from Russia and to a lesser extent China, members aren't as interested in a direct conflict with the West. As I said, a lot of the middle powers depend on the West for security guarantees, for instance. Political interests of the BRICS members coincide only to a degree. So the Kazan Declaration, it mimics a G7 declaration, but you see on geopolitical issues, it's very, very thin. They'll find areas where they can agree and use pretty tough language like Gaza, but other issues you won't find that kind of agreement. So kind of a thinner slice of coinciding interests when you compare it and contrast it to G7, for instance. And then last year, when the BRICS had a choice between deepening their cooperation amongst groups that maybe is more like-minded or expanding, they chose expansion instead. So you'll get a bigger BRICS with a louder voice to critique the Western-led order, but I don't think we're going to be seeing them offering a solid alternate model of global governance that's sufficiently attractive to induce middle powers to align completely with China and Russia.
Well, Rohinton, let me pick up on that angle with you. You know, obviously, if an organization has fewer countries in it that are like-minded, it's easier to run. If they're going to expand the BRICS into potentially 36 different countries, which are presumably more different from one another than the originals, does that make it a tougher organization to run and therefore less threatening to us?
Absolutely. By the way, the G7 is not monolithic in the way countries approach economic policy and their worldview either. Right. But in the case of the BRICS, it reflects the multipolarity in which we live. If we're going to talk about multipolarity, then we have to accept that even within blocs, there's going to be different ways of looking at the world. If the BRICS expands and even half of those 30 countries lined up come in, it softens the image of the BRICS as this monolithic, China-led, Russia-beholden group that just wants to poke the U.S. in the eye. That's not what the BRICS is about. And if the BRICS expands, it gives the West an opportunity to actually pick and choose from different positions that the BRICS folks might be espousing.
Okay. Seva, let me get you on that as well. Is a bigger BRICS something to be less feared by the West?
I think in some ways a rapid expansion of BRICS would be the best thing for the West, because it really would water it down in a way, as sort of a new non-aligned movement rather than this rabid anti-American vehicle. So in that sense, I think it would change its image to, again, not something that's explicitly anti-Western, but as an alternative that other countries might find appealing.
Do you think the BRICS have currently upset the present world order in that I was going to say that we enjoy right now, but there's not a lot of enjoying going on out there, but take a hit at that anyway.
Well, by themselves, I don't think the BRICS can do much, but I think it's a harbinger of things to come. I think it's a symptom of a global order in which everybody is expecting the end of American unipolarity. And some people are expecting it eagerly and waiting for it. Others are cautiously sort of hedging their bets, but I think that's the general consensus. And in the sense that even if it does nothing but provide photo ops for people like Putin, that still serves its purpose. Even by existing, it serves as a challenge to the West in some sense. Whether it can mount a credible challenge in the future, I think depends on a lot of these factors that we talked about.
Carrie Buck, your opinion on that as well. Have the BRICS already upset the current global order?
I think the creation of the BRICS is a symptom rather than a cause. I think that disruption of the global order has been underway for a few decades, to be frank. It is part of a natural evolution of the global order that was built with a much smaller group of countries following World War II, much more like-minded group of countries, but not the West. Technically, it was a bit broader than the West. But now there are a lot more countries seeking to have their voices heard at tables that are more equitable. And so it's almost growing pains as the world tries to incorporate almost, half again the number of states in different levels of development into global architecture, into global governance. So that's the most benign version of why the world is being disrupted. It's not all bad. There's a less benign version in that you'll see a lot of the countries now seeking to join the BRICS are quite critical of double standards of the West. And Gaza is a bit of a case in point. You see the language in the Russian-hosted BRICS declaration on Gaza is pretty strong. So I think the West needs to take the concerns of those countries who feel they're left out of the global order, that it's inequitable, seriously. So what do? Revitalize the G20. Do more on reaching out to those in-between states. Don't just friendshore, but reach out to those in-between states that might tip towards autocracy. Make your model more attractive to them by reaching out. That requires reinvesting in diplomacy.
And on the other side of the coin, Rohinton, if you're a member of the BRICS right now and you want to further disrupt the international order, what are you doing?
There's a quote from Gramsci about how we know what's ending, but we can't visualize what's being created. And we're in that stage in global affairs where we kind of know that the post-war Western-led consensus is frayed, but we have several different ways forward. And so what the BRICS is doing, whether deliberately or by accident, I'd say deliberately, is posing the challenge, creating counterpoints to what we've taken for granted, such as the bank and the fund and SWIFT, and saying, well, look, if that doesn't happen, this does happen. What I really hope happens here is that the G7 and the BRICS come together in the G20. The G20 still remains our only serious operating system to manage globalization. I see BRICS and G7 as marshalling stations where different views are brought together and then they're thrashed out eventually at the G20. If that doesn't happen, then we're back in a world of blocks with nothing at the center. But given the kinds of problems we face, like climate change and pandemics, we can't deal with those regionally and by disagreeing with each other all the time. There has to be a way that people who don't see eye to eye talk to each other, and that's the G20.
Seva, let me get you on that as well. If the BRICS want to further destabilize the current international world order, what should they do?
Well, what they have now is not a coherent black book, but a coherent message. And that message resonates with a lot of the world because they look at the so-called liberal world order, the US-led order, and they see things like Gaza, and they see there should be an alternative to this. Now, it's not clear what the alternative is. For as much as all the BRICS members complain about the current system, and they complain about the dollars, the global currency, there's no consensus on what to do about it. So I think this is going to be an incremental, long-term process where the members slowly, gradually work out their differences and figure out how to work together. But a lot of it also depends on the state of the U.S. If the U.S. is in visible decline, then that galvanizes the entire movement and takes it to a whole new level of importance.
Kerry, do you see the BRICS turning into a political and security alliance against NATO anytime soon?
No, I don't. I really don't. I don't see, as I said earlier, I don't see enough political or commonality on geopolitical issues to bring them together, just to pronounce on geopolitical threats. But whether they'd ever morph into something that is equal to the treaty-based defense guarantee that NATO is guided by, no, not at all. And then some of the newer BRICS members also have deep, deep security relationships with the U.S. I don't see them wanting to trade in U.S. hegemony for falling under Chinese hegemony either. So I don't see it. What I see is a creation of another forum, a forum that'll become more powerful, where countries can choose not just it, but choose to use it when they want to on certain issues. Then they'll bounce back to G20, bounce back to the UN. It's part of a more multifaceted world of different minilateral, multilateral groupings where they can choose to cooperate on issues with their partners of choice. And those partners of choice will shift depending what the issue is. So it's another, to use a bad pun, it's another brick in the wall, but it's not.
I was wondering which one of you was going to go there first, and let the record show it wasn't me. Okay. Rohinton, I want to circle back to that point you made many minutes ago, which was this was the first face-to-face meeting in 5 years between the Modi and Xi, India and China. How significant?
Depends what happens next. Brick in the wall part 2. But, if India and China learn to get along better, then Russia is further marginalized in BRICS and in global affairs more broadly. The whole business about friendshoring and building up India as a bulwark against China starts looking different. And you now have a real view of two successful developing countries, which Russia is not, coming together and facing the West in ways that look different to the West. On the one hand, you have India, which has always been comfortable, prickly but comfortable to deal with. And then you have China, which has been prickly and uncomfortable to deal with. If those two cooperate, then the nature of BRICS changes, the nature of G20 changes, and I'd say the G7 might get serious about expanding in ways that it hasn't seriously considered so far, including bringing in India.
Okay, with a few minutes to go here, let us talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the American election. Seva, if Harris wins, the effect on BRICS will be X. If Trump wins, it will be Y. What's X and Y?
Well, to put it simply, if Harris wins, then BRICS will have a much harder time. If Trump wins, that really galvanizes the anti-Western global movement because, as we know, he's sympathetic to certain leaders of BRICS countries.
The authoritarian ones.
Yes, oddly enough, that's right. So it's easy to laugh about where BRICS comes from, that it was this Goldman Sachs product. But, we have to think about the League of Nations. That also arose as a dream of a few lawyers at the turn of the 20th century. So I think we do have to pay attention to what it could become in the future, especially if the election shows the rest of the world that maybe the model of liberal democracy in the U.S. is not the model that we want to follow, and that there are plausible and appealing alternatives that are now rising. Historically, that's a path away from democracy and towards other regime types.
Carrie Buck, the outcome of the U.S. election affects this how?
Trump increases the unpredictability of the U.S. as a partner for the West. He also takes a more extreme form of isolationism than any U.S. president, I think, to date. So where does that leave? The fact that he likes autocrats is a bad signal, a very bad signal for the West. Will he become more attractive to those middle powers in the BRICS? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if U.S. instability and unpredictability actually helps those members of the BRICS who rely on the U.S. for some security guarantees. So I think the best answer is some chaos, but I also think we're not close to a world where the U.S. and the EU are going to stop being major economic and geopolitical powers for the immediate future. So there'll be an incremental shift. There'll be bad messaging, bad theater around it. Will there be structural changes quickly away from the G7 towards BRICS? I don't think so.
Okay, let me hold you there because I got 30 seconds left. I want to hear Rohinton on this as well.
I'd say that a Trump victory means more for the G7 than it means for BRICS. I'd be more worried about the G7, never mind the BRICS.
Yeah.
Second, whoever wins, there's this slow dynamism in BRICS of institution building, which we talked about a few minutes ago. That will continue. Now, its speed might change here and there, but I'd say the new development bank, the counterpoint to the IMF, counterpoint to payment system, cooperation on commodities is going to continue whoever wins. Because Kamala Harris really has echoed a lot of the anti-China rhetoric that's going on in the U.S. Trump is most crude about it, but Biden and Harris have not been that different on that one. And so if I'm China, I'm not seeing much difference. And so if I'm in the BRICS, I'm not seeing much difference there either.
Mr. Director, can I get a three-shot here so that I can thank all of our guests for a splendid discussion tonight on TVO? Seva Ganitsky from the University of Toronto, Rohinton Medora from CG and McGill, Carrie Buck, former Canadian ambassador to NATO, now University of Ottawa. Thanks so much, you three.
Thank you.
In How to Lose a Country, Ece Temelkuran examines the rise of populism and nationalism around the globe. And given the international climate of late, we thought we'd invite her on to discuss her book and the themes that are so very resonant today. She joins us on the line from London, UK. And Ece, it's great to have you here on TVO. How are you tonight?
It's great being with you. Thank you. I'm in London and the weather is horrible.
When is it not? Anyway, let's see if the state of democracy is as horrible as the weather in London today. And I'm going to start by reading a quote from your book. So I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring this quote up and I'll read along. Democracy, you write, in its current state has been gradually reduced to a performance of itself for a long time. One of the greatest promises humanity made to itself, equality, liberty, fraternity, has been rendered into a tasteless joke. Okay, Ece, what's the tasteless joke you're talking about here?
Well, democracy, I think in its current form is a tasteless joke. I mean, like it looks like, for many people, it looks like a play, a theater act, so to speak, played in rooms such as parliaments and privileged people talking to each other. Many people, I think, they do not feel the connection between themselves and the political decisions anymore. And it has an history. I mean, like since 50 years, since 60 years, I think gradually, democracy lost its promise. It has become a system in which people cannot change their precarity. They can make decisions, they can go to ballot boxes, they can vote, but they cannot really change their lives. They cannot change the economic decisions. They cannot influence the economic decisions. I think that is the main reason or beginning of losing faith in democracy, and loss of faith in democracy by, large masses, I think, turned this into a joke. And there has been anger brewing among the masses, and this anger has been organized by far right. This is where we are. It is a joke, and there are people who are very, very angry being the butt of the joke.
Well, let me pick up on one phrase you used in that answer, and that is a bunch of privileged people getting together in legislatures and making decisions over the others. I sit here today in the capital city of the province of Ontario in Canada. We have a legislative assembly about 6 subway stops south of where I'm sitting right now. The legislative assembly is made up of, a lot of teachers and small business people and farmers and nurses, and, it really is a House of Commons. There's a lot of very ordinary people there. How does that, from the prism of somebody who's unhappy with the world, look like a bunch of privileged people when, in fact, they're not all that privileged?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the things that has been used by far right. Every educated person in their point of view is privileged. Everybody who's a Democrat is a privileged person. But then what I meant to say is a little bit different. And there's a bit of truth in the anger. The anger is organized and mobilized by the far right, but there is some, meaning in that anger. That anger is not completely, pointless, actually. The anger comes from the loss of social justice within the democracy. All these years, all these decades, I think, we have been made to believe that social justice is not the integral part of democracy. And when that social justice is no more, I think that gave the ammunition to far right to say that it is a show for privileged people and we are not counted as first-class citizens.
Understood.
The anger is right, but how it is mobilized is wrong, I think.
Let me get you to clarify a couple of expressions that we hear used all the time, and you use them in your book. Populism versus authoritarianism. What is the distinction between the two?
Well, libraries are full of books talking about this distinction, and I don't want to offend all those academics who have been spending their lives to clarify these terms. But then I think populism is a tool to, very roughly, is a tool to get to power, and then authoritarianism is about how you use it, how you use the power. However, I think we are beyond these words. Kamala Harris very recently and several other people in Washington started using the word fascism, which I have been using since 2016. I was telling with How to Lose a Country that fascism is a global phenomenon and it's rising, and it has common patterns in every country, and that Western democracies are not immune to this. So I think it is time we use the word fascism. We should be brave enough to use it.
I'm going to come back to that word in a second, but I think first we need to get some background in place for those people who are watching or listening who don't know about your background. You're originally from Turkey. You left the country in 2016, and we have seen what has happened to Turkey over the past decade, and certainly if you love democracy, it ain't good. Why don't you tell us about the circumstances that led to your departure?
My personal story is not that important, to be honest, because there have been millions of people have been suffering since 2 decades at least under Erdogan's regime. It all started it didn't start overnight. It creeped this, authoritarian inclinations, fascist inclinations creeped into the system. And then many people were illusioned with the promises, with the fabulous, spectacular promises of the government. And then finally, one day, it was too late to resist against the regime, so to speak. And my story is quite cliche, actually, nowadays. because I was a journalist. I was writing columns. I was a political writer. So I wrote something against Erdogan. The next day I was fired, and then, death threats, rape threats, which are very popular in Turkey and in several other countries, I guess. And then one day I thought, this is too much fear. Fear became too overwhelming, and it started paralyzing me. So I decided to leave the country to realize myself, I think, both intellectually and emotionally as a person. So, yeah, this is what fascism does to people, I think. It just turns your life upside down suddenly.
A pretty obvious follow-up question here. Your book is available in lots of countries. I wonder if it's available in Turkish in Turkey.
No, no, not yet. But one day it will be, I'm sure.
This, 2024 has been a heck of a year for democracy. There have been elections in countries where almost half the world's population lives. The elections either have taken place or are about to take place, obviously the U.S. Next week. Here's a bit of a snapshot here. Of course, Erdogan won in your native Turkey. Modi's BJP won a third term in India. The Freedom Party won in Austria. That's the first time that a far-right party has won the most seats in a legislative election in Austria since World War II. And in Germany, the far-right AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, they came a close second. What do you think the results of these elections so far tell us about the state of democracy in the world today?
Well, you know what? I mean, since the book was published, the first time published in 2019, I'm going around the world telling people like a Cassandra that it is coming towards them as well. And it's not going to be limited to these, crazy countries, so to speak, such as India or Turkey, and it will come to Europe. And now I'm very, very sad that my, so to speak, prophecy came true. But it wasn't a prophecy. It was glaringly clear that it was going to happen in Western democracies as well. I think they felt too comfortable thinking that their democracies are more mature than of those countries in the periphery. But it wasn't, because what is happening, this, as I call it, fascism, the rising fascism, comes from the fact that democracy is living its crisis. And this crisis is very much connected to the lack of social justice. And also, since the Cold War, I think there's this ideological war on left. And now, when center is so weak in European countries and in the United States, in Canada perhaps as well, people are trying to strengthen the center without the left. I think this is what's happening all around the world. And the crisis of democracy is becoming more and more global. And then the Western countries are realizing that their institutions have never been so strong. I mean, they are not that strong as much as they wanted to believe.
We're going to have people consider the 7 features that you say are common patterns in the way that we lose democracy in this world, and you've outlined them in How to Lose a Country. And here are the 7. The strong person creates a movement, terrorizes language, removes shame, dismantles judicial and political mechanisms, designs their own kind of citizen, lets them laugh at the horror of it all, and then builds their own country. And the obvious question coming out of this is, how much of those 7 do you see in Donald Trump's agenda in the United States?
Well, Donald Trump is a very particular example because he didn't come from politics. He was just a funny guy. It is so interesting to see this because in Turkey, we saw, our leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, knows politics very well. He's an incredible politician. He comes from politics. He's experienced and he's intelligent and he has an organization behind him and so on. And Turkey has been resisting this, against this for 20 years. Well, 4 years of Trump was enough to shake the United States. That tells a lot. And Trump, I think, one of the mistakes that the Democrats did in the United States was to laugh at him for too long. I just remember how hopeful they were when Trump was elected for the first time. Many people were thinking that he wouldn't last a year. They didn't take him seriously. And I think they laughed at the horror for too long. I think that might have been the fifth or sixth step in how to lose a country.
Number 6, yes.
That was the biggest mistake. And now I think they're paying for it. What is so interesting about American democracy at this point, like the election campaign, especially, is that Kamala Harris, I'm watching Kamala Harris campaign, and it is a lot of entertainment. And I'm thinking, well, Trump is more entertaining, automatically more entertaining. So why are you getting in that race with him? So this is one of the reasons I call democracy is becoming a joke or a form of entertainment. It looks like a, rock star concert tour, this entire election campaign. And I don't think people are realizing how harmful it is, how harmful this entertainment business is for democracy.
Well, given your knowledge of your native Turkey, we should ask you about what signs you have seen take place over the past decade in Turkey that the United States might be on the brink of right now, and how the United States potentially can avoid what you see as the pitfalls that have happened in Turkey.
Many people are more attracted to the news, like these outrageous statements from Trump, or outrageous events like developments on the ground. But I think what is more important is happening behind the scenes, more in the institutional level. And I think United States is or should be very careful about the loss of judicial mechanisms. It has already started. That's why they're having a big problem about abortion. Supreme Court is very much affected by Trump's first term. But I think they should be careful about who is appointed to which institution. Not only the Supreme Court, those big institutions, but also the small institutions. Those things are important. And those little details do not make it to the news or, first page of New York Times. But those are the key moments when a far right or a fascist leader is climbing to power. And also, they have to take him seriously, really. When he says things, he means them, and he plans to do them. It's not a joke.
Well, that's what the New York Times op-ed section said last weekend, right? They said they gave a litany of Trump's, what do I want to call them, characteristics. And they basically said, believe him when he says he's going to do this because he has a track record of doing it. I want to ask you in our last few minutes here about the word fascism. Because, Ece, I don't have to tell you, it's a very heavy word. It's a big word. When people hear the word fascist, they think Hitler, they think Mussolini. I mean, they crank it right up to 11, if you know what I mean. And I wonder whether the Democratic Party, for too long, has been using the word fascist to describe their political adversaries to the point where people are no longer afraid of the word. And that's part of the reason that they're happy to entertain the idea of Donald Trump as president.
I know. I mean, for many people, it sounded like, for many years, it sounded like, an adolescent, a teenager who doesn't want to tidy his room, shouting his parents, fascist, you're fascist. But it's not like that. Avoiding the word fascism can be the biggest mistake, actually. Because, yes, when you hear the word fascism, you think of Hitler, Mussolini, all these black and white documentaries. And of course, I also miss the clarity of those black and white contrast, the clarity of those documentaries. But we're living in a very colorful time. And fascism does not come as it did in the past in our current situation. It just comes as a form of entertainment, just like Trump does at the moment. So not calling it fascism is both a historical mistake, because, fascism was not actually buried in the battlefields of Second World War. It lingered in this system that we are living in. And it's also a, political mistake. You have to alarm people. This is getting more serious. Many people, due to their privileges, might think that all these, political developments, all these political events wouldn't affect their individual lives. But one thing we learned in Turkey, if you're not interested in politics, if you're not really doing something against fascism, it becomes really interested in you. And then your individual life becomes a very difficult place to live.
Well, I know you wrote this book 5 years ago, but the timing for anybody who wanted to read it today could not be better. It is the key issue in democracies today. How to Lose a Country, the 7 steps from democracy to fascism. Ece Temelkuran, we're really grateful you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Although it was ruled by a revolving door of empires over thousands of years, today Cyprus is divided into 2. Tonight's episode of Forgotten War covers the history of this Mediterranean island and the story of Major General Alain Forain, who was part of the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus in 1974 when the country descended into civil war. This video was produced in partnership with Canada Company.
Peacekeeping does not work if there is fighting, because it's no longer peacekeeping. It would be peacemaking, which is completely different.
In 1974, Major General Alain Forain, as part of the UN peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, found himself in an impossible position.
The mission was to be between the Turkish Cypriot and the Greek Cypriot.
Forain patrolled the Green Line, a demilitarized zone separating the Turkish and Greek populations established in 1964. But by 1974, both sides were at war. To understand this conflict and how the general got here, we need to go back. Cyprus has, due to its strategic location in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, long been a coveted island. It has been ruled by a revolving door of empires over thousands of years. In 1570, the Ottoman or Turkish Empire stormed the island and took it over. This marked the beginning of the influx of Turks to Cyprus. Up to that point, it was predominantly Greek. Fast forward 300 years, and the Ottomans hand over control of the island to Great Britain. But the Ottomans still technically own the island. This won't last for long.
In 1940, the war came, and Turkey was with the German.
So Britain annexed the island. Cyprus became an official crown colony in 1925. By the 1950s, Cyprus was a powder keg ready to explode. Many Greek Cypriots take to the streets, demanding an end to British rule and to become a part of Greece. This is known as enosis.
This created quite a lot of the problem, especially with the Turkish Cypriot, who felt they did not have a space that belonged to them. It was all enclave surrounded by Greek Cypriot.
The Turkish population, once dispersed throughout the island, had become concentrated into Turkish-only areas. They favored a two-state solution, a partition of the island. This is known as Taksim. In 1955, a Greek Cypriot paramilitary group bombed government buildings and killed British and Greek opponents of enosis. That same group later targeted and killed Turkish Cypriot police in an effort to provoke riots in the capital city of Nicosia. In 1959, Britain, Greece, and Turkey got together to come up with a solution which gave neither Greek nor Turkish Cypriots what they wanted. Instead, Cyprus became an independent republic. A power-sharing agreement was drawn up. and Britain still remained on the island, retaining 2 sovereign military bases. 3 years later, the power-sharing agreement fell apart. Violence erupted.
At this stage, the Turkish Cypriots were declaring that it would be impossible ever again to live in harmony with their Greek compatriots.
And there was a lot of killing and, barbarian on both sides.
364 Turkish Cypriots and 174 Greek Cypriots are killed. More than 100 Turkish Cypriot or mixed villages are attacked, and roughly a quarter of the Turkish Cypriot population is displaced.
That's when the United Nations, was asked to provide military support.
UN peacekeeping forces arrived in 1964 and for the next decade attempted to enforce a fragile peace. This came undone in the summer of 1974. On July 15th, a coup was launched by the Cypriot National Guard. It was led by officers from mainland Greece. 5 days later, Turkey invaded Cyprus from the north.
5 o'clock, I think it was around 5 o'clock, somebody said, look, there's parachute coming.
Forain looked up and saw roughly 1,000 Turkish paratroopers dotting the sky.
And then a couple of hours after that, there was about 2,000 other infantrymen that came by helicopter, that landed also in the same area. And then the firing started all over the place, both from the Greek side, the Turkish side. And I said, the situation, is impossible.
The UN blue helmet and the UN flag signals peacekeeping. And you do not fire on peacekeepers. But Forain found these symbols of peace transformed his men into targets.
Plus, we had no vehicle protection. Our guys were doing patrol in bicycle. Well, the last time I looked, it does not offer too much protection.
Since Forain found himself in an active war zone, on July 23rd, he convinced the British to lend him a lightly armored vehicle known as a Ferret.
So with the Brit, I started to patrol.
A mortar fell on a nearby first aid station. Those rushing, trying to put out the fire, were attacked. Forain was ordered to protect them.
So when I arrived there, everything had burned.
Forain began to leave the charred first aid station, but something caught his eye.
I saw some parachutists, running around. I said, what the hell is going on?
2 of Forain's men, Captain Normand Blaquière and Private Michel Plouffe, were escorting Turkish soldiers who were fleeing a failed attack on a Greek location. The Turkish soldiers feared without an escort, they would be slaughtered.
And as they were going to escorting, I think there were 8 or 9 Turkish soldiers, the Greek started to open fire. And I think there was 4 or 5 Turks that were killed, plus 3 or 4 that were wounded. And Blaquière was hit in both legs, and then Plouffe covered him. So I decided immediately to send the Ferret, to a location. I said, go there, because I'm going to go and get the Blaquière and Plouffe, but if they fire at me, I will give you the order to fire. So I dive in to get Blaquière.
As Forain crawled to his men, the Greeks opened fire. With bullets flying towards him, he turned around and gave 2 signals. One to the Brits manning the Ferret, and another to his men on the 50 caliber machine gun. They returned fire.
50 caliber has a sound, boom, boom, boom. It's really fantastic. When you're there, you hear that sound, you say, my God, I'm protected.
Even with this protective cover, the Greeks still continued to fire on Forain.
Just as I was going down, Plouffe was hit by a bullet. It went through his helmet and through his mouth. So when I arrived there, he opened his mouth and he had the bullet on his tongue. And we start laughing, crazy, how you react in those circumstances.
Forain then dragged Blaquière, who was shot in both legs, up the creek to safety. But he still had 1 man in danger.
Then I went back to get Plouffe and get him out.
Forain rushed his men to the hospital.
They were able to save Blaquière, and Plouffe just a little bit of a chirurgy, and he was okay.
Forain was awarded the Star of Courage, the 2nd highest award for bravery in Canada.
I just did my job, so for me, it was great that they gave me the medal, but we were a team, That's the mentality that we try to instill in all our soldiers. So to me, I was only doing my job, normal.
Fighting continued throughout the summer. There was a mass exodus moving north and south. More than 150,000 Greek Cypriots and almost 50,000 Turkish Cypriots became refugees on their own island. By the time a ceasefire was negotiated, Turkey had taken over a third of Cyprus. The UN buffer zone was re-established and extended, carving the island into two. And not much has changed since then.
There's still a lot of friction between Greece and Turkey. I think it will take a long time, if ever, that they are reunification and that they're able to go back to a certain form of conciliation that they had in the past.
For now, the Greek southern portion is a member of the European Union, and the northern Turkish side is currently recognized by just one country in the world, Turkey. 28 Canadian peacekeepers have died in Cyprus. UN peacekeeping forces remain there to this day, patrolling the Green Line. Forin believes the Canadian Armed Forces can still play an integral role in stabilizing the world, much as they did in Cyprus. But he sees an under-resourced military that is not what it once was.
I don't see the future, being rosy. That's unfortunate. The world is here, it's surrounding us. So if problem arise somewhere, it will have an impact on us eventually. And if you're not able to try to help them, then that problem will become yours at one point or another, whether you like it or not.
This video was made in partnership with Canada Company.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, October 31st, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, we welcome Canadian acting legend Saul Rubinek to discuss his new play, Playing Shylock. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Happy Halloween, everybody, and we'll see you again tomorrow.